Welcome to Beginning with Moses, Discovering Jesus in the Bible. I'm Pastor Gary Schulte. Hello friends, welcome to episode 40 of Beginning with Moses, where we continue our study of the amazing book of Numbers. As we pick up our story, the sin, rebellion, and utter lack of faithfulness of the people rears its ugly head once again. After hearing the scary, fearful report of the 10 spies, the people grumble against Moses and rise up with one voice and cry out to Yahweh, "Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? Let's choose another leader and go back." So they add treachery and abandonment to their nervous fear. If I were Yahweh, after all that he's done to bring them to the cusp of the fulfillment of his rich promises to them, I'd blast them all off the face of the earth. But all he does is give them what they want. Okay, you want to go back to Egypt? You can go back to Egypt. But little do you know, I'm going to make you wander in the desert for another 38 years or so. And all of you now living are going to die in the desert. Only 2 of you will survive to make it into the promised land. Faithful Joshua and Caleb. Not surprisingly, the spy mission and subsequent rebellion of chapters 13 and 14 of Numbers point forward with brilliance toward Jesus. The promised land that they roundly reject points forward to the end-time rest that is promised all the faithful in Christ in Hebrews 4, verses 1 to 11. The promised land in eternity will be a very physical realm flowing with milk and honey. The spy's unbelief provides a picture of the future rejection of Jesus and his gospel message. Joshua and Caleb, by contrast, are Christ-like figures of faithful obedience and forerunners of true believers. The wilderness punishment that God responds with typifies spiritual exile and testing, such as that talked about in Hebrews 3, verses 7 to 19. In fact, Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 use this exact episode to warn against unbelief and to urge the church to enter God's rest through faith in Christ. But faithful Moses intervenes again, speaking these existentially true words. Yahweh is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. That is, of course, unless he later sends his own son to take on himself the punishment due all people. As Yahweh sends his people back into the desert, he removes his shadow from them, lest he kill them all himself. The people arrogantly forge ahead into battle anyway without his blessing and wind up being crushed by the Amalekites. Are they trying to make up for that lack of faith at the border of the promised land? But Yahweh, he still loves his rebellious children, and so he forgives them yet again. Okay, Yahweh is saying basically, let's try this again. First I made you my people, and I taught you how to act as my people. Now I'm remaking you in my forgiveness, so let's try teaching you my holy will one more time. Yahweh instructs Moses to tell the people, get this, after you enter the land I am giving you. Get that? After you enter the land I am giving you, I will give you my holy Torah once again. The promise of the land is back on, and it's back to being a land that is given, not a land to which they are being sent. The incidents at Kadesh all point forward to Jesus. A faithful remnant enters the land. So shall it be in the end at the final return of Christ. Caleb, the main voice of this faithful remnant, is from the tribe of Judah, same as Jesus. Joshua, for his part, whose name is identical to that of Jesus, both names are actually Yeshua, which means Yah saves or Yahweh saves, is from the tribe of Ephraim, which Yahweh will bless in the future as the head tribe of the northern kingdom, about 400 years later or so. The number 40 also continues to be significant typologically. Old Israel spent 40 days in paradise. The land of milk and honey then rebelled and were required to wander for 40 years in the desert as punishment. The new faithful Israel, reduced to one, Jesus, spent 40 days in the wilderness, according to Matthew 4, was 100% obedient and faithful to the Father, and thus was rewarded with an eternity in paradise in heaven, which is also the heritage of all his people. Numbers 16 begins with the account of Korah and his fellow Reubenites, leading a band of 250 men in rebellion against the sole spiritual leadership of the high priest Aaron. Their sinful desire for their piece of the pie is yet another example of sinful people rejecting God's appointed mediator. But looking back, this is quite the prophecy-fulfilling sin of like father, like son. Do you remember? Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob, and when Jacob blessed him just before dying in Genesis 49:3, he said this, "You are my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power." Well, Reuben lost that position of prominence to Judah because he had tried to usurp the position of his father by sleeping with his concubine Bilhah. That's recorded in Genesis 35:22 and 49:4. Reuben is all about that power religion we just talked about, trying with all his might to reclaim his place in the cosmic pecking order. Korah's sin, of course, does not sit at all well with Yahweh. So Yahweh causes the earth to open up underneath them and swallow the ringleaders up. Then Yahweh sends fire to consume and finish off the 250 co-conspirators, as prophesied by Moses before it happened. Total vindication for both of God's appointed mediators. God gave the people what they wanted in sending them back to Egypt. Well, hell is exactly that, giving sinful people exactly what they want. The descent into the pit, as described in chapter 16, verses 31 to 32, and the consuming fire, verse 35, very much foreshadow the fate of the wicked on the last day, as portrayed in Revelation 20. Ultimate vindication for God's one and only existential mediator, Jesus Christ. As part of this important triumph and vindication for his chosen ones, Yahweh causes Aaron's staff to come to life with sprouts and buds. Only Aaron's staff, cut off and dead, blossoms with life. Just so, Christ's empty tomb blossoms with life, confirming Jesus as our ever-living high priest. As we roll into chapter 19 of Numbers, Yahweh introduces the cosmic significance of the Red Heifer, who, according to his detailed instructions, was to be sacrificed outside the camp as a whole burnt offering pleasing to Yahweh of both flesh and blood. This, of course, points to Jesus at Calvary once again, but also to Jesus in the waters of baptism and in the Lord's Supper. Verse 17 of chapter 19 is key. The designation ashes that the burnt carcass of the red heifer was to be reduced to, Epher in Hebrew changes to dust, afar in the Hebrew. Just the slightest change, but hugely cosmically significant. The use of the specific term dust provides a link to the fall of man in Genesis and the judgment that in death man will return to the dust from which he was created. The red heifer is yet another Old Testament sacrament where God uses his material creation to convey his presence, his forgiveness, and his very life to humans. Despite this manifold grace, the people grumble yet again, this time because they are thirsty. Yahweh responds quickly and graciously as he instructs Moses to strike a huge rock with his staff. But now Moses' own sin comes back to the fore. When the water does not immediately appear with the first strike, Moses strikes the rock a second time, arrogantly acting as if the water coming from the rock is his own doing. Even in the midst of all the people's grumbling and Moses' arrogant sin, Yahweh still makes the water flow from the rock. But the punishment from Yahweh comes equally swiftly to Moses. He's told he won't ever enter the promised land now. Things are looking quite bleak indeed for the aging Moses. By this time, Miriam is already dead and Aaron is soon to be. As important as Yahweh made Moses to be as his appointed mediator, he is still just a sinful man. And the book is about to close on him. For now, though, the water from the rock is another Old Testament sacrament pointing to Jesus. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10:3 and 4, they all ate the same spiritual food as us and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. What? How's that? Well, because as Jesus said of himself, with regard to his eternal nature, before Abraham I am, Jesus and Yahweh are one. When Jesus was sacrificed on the cross for the sins of the world, water and blood poured out from his pierced side to sprinkle the nations. As Jesus' Spirit dwells within us through faith, rivers of living water flow out from us as well. That's in John 7, verse 38. So both these life-giving Old Testament sacraments, both involving water and blood, point as if at a bullseye at the two life-giving sacraments Jesus institutes in the New Testament. Amazing stuff. But once again, that's enough for this episode. We'll continue our coverage of the book of Numbers in episode 41 with the account of the bronze serpent. So much more to come. Stay with me. God bless.